Welcome to Commons Conversations, a series of interviews with campaigners sharing their experiences and insights into activism, learning in movements, radical history, and more. The program is broadcast by Community Radio 3CR and produced by the Commons Social Change Library, a website containing over 1,000 resources for campaigners, which can be accessed for free at commonslibrary.org. In today's program, Commons Librarian Holly Hammond talks with novelist, playwright, screenwriter and historian Sarah Schulman about lessons from campaigns led by the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, better known as ACT UP, during the 1980s and 1990s. A participant in the campaigns, Schulman's book, Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993, is based on over 200 interviews. As the book blurb states, quote, "In just 6 years, ACT UP New York, a broad and unlikely coalition of activists from all races, genders, sexualities and backgrounds, changed the world. Armed with rancour, desperation, intelligence and creativity, it took on the AIDS crisis with an ingenious and multifaceted attack on the corporations, institutions, governments and individuals who stood in the way of AIDS treatment for all. They stormed the FDA and NIH in Washington, D.C. and started needle exchange programs in New York. They took over Grand Central Terminal and fought to change the legal definition of AIDS to include women. They transformed the American insurance industry, weaponized art and advertising to push their agenda, and battled and beat the New York Times, the Catholic Church and the pharmaceutical industry. Their activism in its complex and intersectional power transformed the lives of people with AIDS and the bigoted society that had abandoned them." In the following conversations, Sarah and Holly discuss the nature of effective coalitions, the challenges of accurately documenting social movements, and what activists can learn from ACT UP today.
So just to kind of start for some context, the Commons Social Change Library, our project is gathering the kind of collective wisdom of people engaged in social change so that people can learn and it can inform future action. And part of that is connecting people with history, connecting activists with history. And it's really a constant struggle, I think, to, counter the erasure of collective action and the role that it plays in creating the world that we live in. And I know you're very passionate about this. I was really struck by the story that you shared in Gentrification of the Mind when you kind of heard AIDS activism being erased, in real time. Yeah, just interested to know, this correcting the record kind of compulsion that you have, why is that so important to you and how did that play out with the ACT UP Oral History Project and the book?
Well, I think it's been a lifelong thing for historical reasons and personal reasons. I think I'm a person who has not benefited by the facts being hidden, and that I do much better when the structures are made visible. In terms of AIDS history, AIDS has been misrepresented since the first day. And the entire history of AIDS is filled with false stories. At the beginning, first of all, AIDS is probably 100 years old. And, people date it to 1981, but that's only when science recognized the pattern that came to be known as AIDS. So even the start date is wrong. And then from the beginning, at that time, there was a lot of pseudoscience abounding in the early 80s about the, quote, causes of homosexuality and that they were biological. So far, no one has ever found a biomarker for queerness or homosexuality, but at that time, that was the theory. So the first name for the disease was GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. There's no such thing as gay-related immune deficiency. Immune deficiency is not gay. But, or gay cancer, there's no such thing as gay cancer. But, so from the very, very beginning, the issue has been misrepresented, the realities of people with AIDS and the truth about AIDS activism have all been misrepresented. And that was really my major motive for doing this book.
I think AIDS activism, it had a big impact on me as a young activist, but also reading the book, it just really feels like the energy of the movement, echoes through the decades. Like it's just so powerful. And one thing I was picking up in your writing was around the urgency of people living with AIDS were at the centre of things and they didn't have time to waste. And that urgency was the real kind of engine in AIDS activism. I was kind of thinking about, times I've come across a lot of urgency and desperation in groups I've been working with. It hasn't always been helpful. It's kind of led to a resistance to being strategic or reflecting and just a kind of staying emotional all the time and reacting. But I feel like in your writing, it really comes across as a really positive force, which allowed people to take on, simultaneous actions of different kinds and kind of be accepting of that. You want to say a little more about that element?
Well, I think that, people with AIDS were living against the clock. There were no treatments. And once people got sick, they died very quickly. And also just for younger people, an AIDS death is a terrible death. I mean, people really suffer because as your immune system breaks down, there's like dementia and blindness, and you can't retain nutrition. I mean, so it was an emergency. And therefore, the agenda of the movement was determined by the needs of people with AIDS. So one of the things that meant was that there was really no theoretical discussion, which is very interesting because it was action-oriented, because people had concrete goals. And I think this is a really good lesson for political organizing in general. You become the expert on the issue, and you determine a concrete goal, something that you must have, that is reasonable, winnable, and doable, not abstract or vague. And then you design the solution of how to achieve this thing. So, for example, one of the early obstacles that people with AIDS faced is that the Food and Drug Administration was very slow to approve drugs. And people in ACT UP who had no policy backgrounds and no science backgrounds, like this playwright named Jim Igo, just studied the FDA until they could design a fast-track system that would allow very sick people to access experimental drugs before they had completed the approval process. So you design the solution. Then you go to the powers that be and present your solution. Of course, they say no. And that's when you do nonviolent but theatrical civil disobedience to force them or pressure them through the media by informing the public through your actions that you have the winnable and doable, reasonable solution. So it's very systematic, and that's really what a campaign is, having a concrete demand. So I think that really came from the fact that that's what people with AIDS had concrete needs.
But I also hear in that, really fundamental tenets of community organising in terms of, how you cut your issue and how you go after getting the solution and hold the power holders accountable in that process. One thing I really appreciated in Let the Record Show was you talking about the different influences on AIDS activism, including feminist organising around reproductive rights and Black liberation, whether people had been involved or kind of observed it. And it's there in your description of direct action as well. And so, we're really concerned with how do people learn about social change and how do people learn within movements. And one way is from the experience of the people who are there. But I'm kind of curious, are there other forms of learning that you think are important in social movements? And also, I guess, history writing or the work to kind of keep telling the story while the action happens?
Well, the first thing is that no movement is discrete. There's no such thing as a movement that just comes out of nowhere. I'm just reading a very interesting book by Bettina Aptheker, who's like 83 years old, whose father was on the Central Committee of the Communist Party USA. And it's about how many different roots of queer liberation came from the Communist Party. Mattachine, one of the first gay organizations, their founders, Harry Hay and Rudy Gernreich, were kicked out of the Communist Party. But also like lesbian separatism, Alex Dobkin and women's music, she grew up in the Communist Party. PFLAG, Parents of Friends of Lesbians and Gays, was founded by Jean Manford, who was a member of the Communist Party. I mean, so you're seeing things that we thought were, separate actually have these roots in people who were highly politicized and knew how to think analytically and had basic organizing skills. Because, the reason that there was an autonomous gay and lesbian movement in the first place is not because gay people wanted to be separate. It's because we were kicked out of the left. So not only did the Communist Party kick out gay people, but the Black Civil Rights Movement famously sidelined Bayard Rustin. The feminist movement had a number of lesbian purges that have not yet been really historicized. And so that's why there was an autonomous queer movement. It wasn't for political reasons. It was de facto, but many of those people had come from previous experiences. Yeah. So recognizing that is very important. And then I think the second thing is that, in America, we have the John Wayne myth, right, of the white male individual hero who comes in and saves the day. And this person doesn't exist, but also they can't exist because that's not how change gets made. At least in America, change gets made by coalitions. And there's no other way. So breaking down some of these myths, which are obstacles to people moving forward, is a really important part to understanding how to build campaigns.
Oh, there's just so much in there. It's great. Yeah, I think I really think about like this sort of generative tension in social movements of inclusion and exclusion. So like what happens when people aren't able to participate in the left and create their autonomous movement, or also, you have ACT UP being predominantly white male, and then the other groups that then organise to make sure that their issues are being addressed, so it's kind of this productive struggle, not necessarily enjoyable at the time for people to be experiencing that exclusion, but the way that it leads to autonomous organising can be really powerful.
Well, I think, this question of exclusion inclusion is very interesting because people have a false idea of what a coalition is. It's based on those sort of Benetton ads, if you remember those from the olden days, one Asian person, one Black person, one Latino. That is not how coalitions work. Coalitions are usually discrete communities of people who have their own interests, who cooperate with each other, and whose work resonates with each other. That's actually what they are. So because of that structure, ACT UP, which was predominantly a white gay male organization, actually ended up winning the biggest victories for women and poor people in the history of HIV when they got the government to change the definition of what symptoms you had to get an AIDS diagnosis, thereby getting women access to benefits and experimental drugs. It's very rare in history to find a white male organization that wins a major victory for women and people of color. But the reason that happened is that the women and people of color in ACT UP, although they were a minority, tended to be more politically sophisticated because they were coming from the previous movements of the 70s. Now, among the white gay men, the older ones had been in the gay liberation movement, people like Vito Russo, for example. But many of the younger ones had never been political before. So the more savvy feminists, and also this was a time of fascist dictatorships in Latin America, and there was an exile community of gay men who had also come from those movements or from Mexico City student movement of the late 1960s. What these groups of more savvy women and people of color did was that they did not waste their time trying to make the white gay men be less sexist or less racist. Like they would never say, stop the action, we have to have consciousness raising. They never did that because you could spend your whole life trying to change one person and fail. But what they did was they kept their eye on the prize of what they needed to win for their constituency and rallied the ample resources of the larger organization. So for example, ACT UP had an art auction that raised $650,000. So there was quite a bit of money. So when women with AIDS needed money to travel, let's say to Washington or something to testify at a hearing, and they needed to stay in hotels, obviously people were sick, they didn't have to raise the money. They could just go to fundraising and get the money. When the Latino caucus realized that people with AIDS in Puerto Rico had no support, they just went to fundraising and got the money and went to Puerto Rico and started ACT UP Puerto Rico. So instead of obstructing themselves, they kind of rose above the fray and figured out strategically how to use these resources to win for their constituencies. And that's a very important lesson.
And in that, the diverse strengths that come together in a coalition. So if you have one section of your coalition has really great contacts in the establishment or ability to raise money, and others have, real strategic nous and campaigning experience, that coming together in the coalition is really powerful.
That can work for a while, but it also can backfire.
Yeah.
Because we did have a sector that was very effective in connecting, because this is the 80s, right? So the government was all white male, the media was all white male, and the private sector was all white male. Even me as a white lesbian, there was no one like me. There was no Rachel Maddow or anyone like that, right? So there was a group of people, mostly men in ACT UP, who were very well educated, who came from upper class backgrounds, and they were able to connect really well with these insider men. But on the other hand, that didn't necessarily trickle down, because, for example, it took the women 2 years to be able to get a meeting with Fauci when the men were meeting with him all the time. So, there's not necessarily a trickle down effect.
For sure. And really getting the sense that the insider-outsider combo was a strength in the early days, but that the gap widened over time and contributed to the split. It's always very heartbreaking, I think, reading those stories of people when they're in division after having been in unity, and the kind of shock, like, how can you do this? And then there's the complete blind spot of what the problem was.
Could be. I mean, there's a lot of ways of looking at it, because, to be really honest, if we had insisted that these groups of people who were at the inside represented the diverse coalition, they probably wouldn't have been listened to, so probably there was no way to transgress those limitations. And that's a really rough thing to say, and it's a hard thing for me to say, but I think it's realistic, given the way everything was constructed at the time.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just grappling with this a little more. With the Commons Library, one of our most popular resources is Bill Moyer's Movement Action Plan and the 4 roles of social activism. And I think people are always really hungry for frameworks that help them understand differences and tensions in social movements. Like, we do it this way, they do it that way. Is there a way we can be complementary? Maybe to have some begrudging respect for each other's role. But I think like in terms of being able to work together effectively over time, it makes me think about, your emphasis on deep communication in conflict is not abuse. Like, how do we need to be able to stay with each other while we're in conflict to work through things? Is there potential for movements to be much more powerful, but able to kind of communicate across those divides?
I don't know if communication would have helped ACT UP, but I think the one thing that really helped ACT UP was simultaneity of action. It was not a consensus-based movement, and we did not have to agree on things. It was a majority vote. So if you had an idea for an action and I thought it was ridiculous, I would argue with you. And also, we were not conflict averse. It was like, Jews and Italians, people screaming at each other and this type of thing. And we're still screaming at each other in our old age. But in the end, I wouldn't stop you from doing what you wanted to do. I just wouldn't do it. And then I would go get my 5 people to do my idea. And this is what made the whole thing work, because, yeah, there were people who were doing negotiations with pharmaceutical companies and that sort of thing. But then there were people who were trying to get needle exchange, who were, former and current IV drug users. And harm reduction was a brand new idea at the time. The predominant approach was abstinence, insisting on abstinence. So harm reduction was something that a lot of people in ACT UP didn't understand. And they didn't necessarily support needle exchange. But the needle exchange people, being addicts, some of them themselves, took very high-risk strategy of deliberately exchanging needles illegally in order to get arrested so that they could have a test case that they could have lost, but they did win. And then you have things like a Haitian Underground Railroad, because when President Aristide was overthrown by a coup in Haiti and a huge number of people fled to the United States, the government tested them and found that a large number of people were HIV positive and incarcerated them in Guantanamo. And ACT UP's housing committee was involved with getting people housing so that they could get out of Guantanamo. Now, that had nothing to do with needle exchange and nothing to do with negotiating with pharma. And it's not the same people. These are different kinds of people doing this work. But the fact that it's all happening at the same time is what creates, the paradigm shift. My study of history tells me that no movement that has tried to insist that everyone agree on one strategy or one analysis has ever succeeded. And I don't think there's any exceptions to that. I think by definition, that is a fail. because people are different. I know it's just like a basic thing to say, but people can only be where they're at. And trying to force people to be someplace where they're not at does not work. And what does work is facilitating people being effective from wherever they're at. Like that's what actual leadership is. So you need this simultaneity, and you have to live with the discomfort of being in an organization with people doing things that you don't like. One thing that's really interesting about ACT UP is that no one was ever thrown out. Now, there was one kind of cultish political party called the New Alliance Party that tried to take over ACT UP, and they were thrown out. But no individuals were ever thrown out. And let me tell you, there were a lot of crazy people in there because it was a very high stress situation. And people were very angry, very upset. But no matter what anyone did, people could get angry at them and yell at them, but no one was ever excluded. Because in order to exclude somebody, you have to feel like you're better than them. And this was at a time when, homosexual sex was illegal in the United States. And gay people with AIDS were the bottom of the barrel. And nobody had supremacy ideology about themselves enough to say, you're not good enough to be in a group with me. So that never happened. It functioned like a community. And a community is not a curated thing, for better or for worse.
Constantly changing and different pressures coming in and different talents and skills coming to the fore. You really get that sense of it.
Well, brothers and sisters, what a show of strength we've got here today.
Local issues.
So I'm here at the school kids strike for climate action.
Live coverage.
Join the spirit of this gathering here today at IMAP.
Your voices.
So give us a bit of a lowdown about what's happening.
There's about 250 people here at the moment.
Community struggles.
We're now in front of the Tundaminawaya Maulboyhina Monument. I'd like to thank Community Radio 3CR, who for the last decade has been broadcasting here.
Feed Radical Radio. Your membership is vital.
A few hundred people about to pass us right now. Lots of young people standing up for their future.
Subscribe today. Go to 3cr.org.au/subscribe or call the station on 9419 8377.
You're listening to Commons Conversations, a program in which campaigners discuss their experiences of creating social change. In today's program, Commons Librarian Holly Hammond talks with novelist, playwright, screenwriter and historian Sarah Schulman about lessons from campaigns led by the New York AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power in the 1980s and 1990s.
What you're saying about not being a consensus organisation was the key strength. It could have gone a different way in terms of the influence of consensus in the environment movement, the peace movement, and the women's movement in the 80s and 90s. So, it's an interesting example.
They didn't have the same system of immediate winnable demands.
Yeah.
Though, it's interesting because when you look at the history of American radicalism, there's really like two different strands. And one is like the utopian socialists, the anarchists of the 20s, the communists of the 30s, the Beats, the hippies, gay liberation, Occupy Wall Street. These are movements that want total system change and consciousness change. And then you have reform movements like ending slavery, women getting the vote, making abortion legal, AIDS activism. And these are absolutely reform movements. They have very concrete demands from the system. And I feel like the society really moves forward the most when both of these kinds of movements are active at the same time and are dialogic. So when you have Black power and civil rights, that's when you have this subculture that gets built. Or when you have gay liberation and gay rights. But, after AIDS, we lost gay liberation and we had only gay rights. And that's why it's become so assimilationist and pro-military and all of that.
Thinking again about that kind of concrete demands, but also like paradigm shifting and big picture visioning of how things could be different. What kind of ripples do you see from AIDS activism?
Millions and millions of people are alive today. Who wouldn't be? That's it. So many people that we know and our parents and everybody are alive today because of that. But then there's really concrete things like when ACT UP won the right. So women were excluded from experimental drug trials. And this is a very interesting bit of history In the 1960s, there was a drug called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women, and many women had children born without limbs. And they sued pharma, and they got big settlements. So pharmaceutical companies' reaction was to ban women from experimental drug trials. So a woman could not get in a trial. And when you have a disease like AIDS, where there are no treatments, trials are the only treatments. So the fight to get women into those trials resonates perhaps more widely than almost anything ACT UP won, because today, any woman in the world with HIV who takes a medication is taking something that was tested on women. So that's a very, very big reach.
Yeah, really profound. I want to ask a bit about grief, because I'm conscious that, in these times of escalating crisis, there's big losses happening and people are needing to find ways to respond. So I think in the movement for Black Lives and in Australia, the movement to stop deaths in custody, like every time there's a death, that's a trigger event in the movement to, again, kind of mobilise and make the demands. And with the climate crisis, as we see increasing climate impacts, there's real devastation happening and massive impact on communities. So an activist skill really is to be able to experience loss and stay in action. And with ACT UP, death was so present, it was all around you all the time, which just makes me think, how did ACT UP keep going in the face of that?
Well, it wasn't for everybody. People who, when Jim Hubbard and I started the ACT UP Oral History Project, and I want to invite people to go to our website, which is actuporalhistory.org. We've had 14 million hits on our website, by the way, but that's where we have interviews with 188 surviving members of ACT UP that we conducted over 18 years. Now, one of our questions was, what do these people have in common? Because actually it was a very small number of people. This is not a mass movement of hundreds of thousands of people. This is, meetings with from 300 to 700 people a week. And the largest demo was 7,000 people. But they were incredibly effective, these individuals. They were very committed to being effective. And, one of our big questions is, what do these people have in common? When we were trying to understand that. And because it wasn't for everybody, it was very tough in there. Not only all the suffering and the death, but the anger and the screaming and the fighting and all of that. So you had to be a certain type of person to start with. There are also people, we had public funerals. We carried people's bodies through the streets. We had an action called the Ashes Action, where people threw the ashes of their loved ones on the White House lawn. There was a lot of expression. But a lot of people did suffer and are suffering now, like the first generation of men who mostly got infected before people knew what was going on, or that first generation, they have paid a very high price. They've been through, their lives have been at risk a million times. They've been through terrible medications. They've lost their partners and friends and social circles. And in ACT UP, that generation has had a lot of trouble with drugs, with crystal meth, with seroconverting late in life, poverty because people thought they were going to die and they were off their career track. It's a generation that has really paid, and attention has not been paid to them. I think that they're underseen and undersupported as now people are moving into their 70s.
And people's understanding of AIDS has changed so much in terms of the treatments that are available now, and with PrEP as well. I think it's that is also kind of erasing the past kind of sense of AIDS.
Yeah, in New York, we have about 1,500 deaths a year, and it's because we don't have a functional healthcare system. So it's really underclass people who have no healthcare and end up in the emergency room when it's too late, kind of thing. And the PrEP thing is very interesting because, the standard of care treatment for HIV right now is drugs that virally suppress you to the degree that you're biologically incapable of infecting anybody. So if everybody who was positive actually had access to the standard of care, there would be no need for PrEP, right? So Gilead, the biblically named company that makes all their money from PrEP, their huge profit is based on the fact that we don't have healthcare delivery. So, there's an irony there.
That's shocking, isn't it? And Gilead, that's like The Handmaid's Tale.
Right.
On that. Yeah, you were talking before about the expression of grief and, different actions and different rituals, that meant that could be collective. I'm wondering about the role of art in social change, which is, topic dear to you in terms of being a novelist and a playwright and a screenwriter.
It's a very particular combination of things. So first of all, this is New York. It still had not completely gentrified, right? So it still was a place that was on the cutting edge of new art ideas for the world, and also advertising ideas. So you had graphic designers, fine artists or studio artists, and advertising media people who were all on the cutting edge because it was New York. So that you also had that gay people were very alienated from the culture and were aesthetically opposed to mainstream culture. So queer people were inventing some of the most exciting aesthetic expressions of the time. It all ends with the rainbow flag, one of the most banal inventions possible, and it's an anti-art invention. But so you had these very creative, alienated people who were in these cutting-edge professions. And that's really a lot about how ACT UP developed their look. I did an interesting interview with Marlene McCarty, who was the only woman in Grand Fury, which was one of the big art collectives in ACT UP. And she had come out of graphic design. And she said that it was really interesting because at the beginning, when the messages were very simple, they used techniques from advertising for ACT UP posters, and they were very effective. But when the messages got more complex as AIDS evolved, those advertising techniques no longer worked, because what they discovered is that you cannot convey complex ideas with advertising. This art was a big source of fundraising for ACT UP, because ACT UP was a political movement, not a non-for-profit or an NGO. So they did not apply for funding. So one of the main ways it was funded was by selling T-shirts with these incredible graphics on them. Everybody from Keith Haring to Lola Flash to all these people, Zoe Leonard, were designing T-shirts. And the first day that ACT UP T-shirts went on sale on the street, we made $30,000 in cash. So, that it just became part of the identity of queer people all over the world, was wearing these ACT UP T-shirts.
That's amazing. Yeah, definitely for me, the first ACT UP poster that I saw was like a pink triangle, silence equals death. It was just so compelling. And even I think the acronym AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power kind of like sparked my mind in wonderful ways. Yeah, definitely rippled out all around the world. And there's still like a really potent imagery to look at now. I'm really curious to hear from you, like since ACT UP, are there examples of direct action that you've seen people doing that you've thought have been particularly effective or exciting?
Well, it is all the time. But one of the things about social movements is that it's very, very hard to document them accurately. I was able to do this because I've been covering AIDS as a reporter since the early 80s. So I have knowledge of the full range and arc of the story. Even by the time ACT UP started, I'd already been covering it for about 5 years. So I had a front row seat. I was in ACT UP. Jim and I were able to interview 188 people, and we could pull it all together. It was sort of inspired by this earlier book by Taylor Branch called Parting the Waters, that does a similar thing for the civil rights movement, interviewing the rank and file and finding out what the strategies actually were and cohering them. But getting that kind of information is very difficult because the corporate media does not report accurately on social movements. So right now, there are things going on all over the United States and all over the world that we don't know about. Like there's a movement against police violence, and this movement is in every city. But I don't know who the leaders are, and I don't know what their demands are. I don't know what they're doing. We see movements for immigrant rights. We see movements, abolitionist, prison abolition movements, Palestine solidarity. Students for Justice in Palestine is the largest political student organization in the whole country. There's so much going on, but it's just not covered. And we don't have a coherent leftist press that can report every day or every week on what's happening nationally. So there's quite a bit, but I can't itemize it for you. No. One change that I can articulate is that, as we discussed earlier, the gay movement was a de facto movement because the left wouldn't have us. But today, every radical movement has queer and trans people in leadership. So you could really say that radical queer politics is now present in a very wide range of movements. There still is like a rarefied white male gay rights movement with organizations like Human Rights Campaign. I don't even know who those people are. I could not tell you the name of the person who's in charge. I never interact with them and I never see them, but I know that they're there and they have a lot of money. But that's where the gay movement is. Otherwise, it's this kind of queer general participation, and that's where it should be.
Yeah, we're everywhere in leadership in all those different movements. Back in the 2000s, when I visited the US, I came across a Human Rights Campaign shop, and it was just full of all this different merchandising with rainbows and the HRC logo, and I did not understand what was going on. And it was quite similar to like the college shops, that are just all full of the brand of the university that people...
With everything that's happening now, abortion being illegal now in a number of states, the Don't Say Gay laws, this new law that says that not every state has to marry gay people, all the anti-trans laws that are going on, the repression of gay and trans books in school libraries. Where is HRC? Like, how come I never see them on television? I never hear from them. It's just remarkable. Most of the leadership has come from like the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is lawyers who are out in front on all of these issues. But these highly paid people, I don't know where they are.
Part of that, right, is that they're not feeling accountable to a bigger movement. Well, maybe actually accountability is a good place to look, because I know that's a really strong theme for you, personal accountability and accountability in relationships and, accountability, keeping power holders accountable. Yeah, what would you like to be seeing in this space as we go forward?
Well, we're in a really bad place in the United States. And one of the problems is that we're spinning things as victories that are basically squeakers. Half of the people in this country are so racist and crazy that they're voting for insane candidates. And the fact that it's 49% and that the other side is 51% is being trumpeted as a victory, but actually it's a disaster. Something has gone very, very wrong. And the Democratic Party, their leadership is very poor. There is, however, a left-wing flank of the party that has the kinds of people that were never in government before. Young people of color, people like Rashida Tlaib, like Ayanna Pressley, like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are really, socialists and leftists. And just a few years ago, people like that would have been fringe left-wing leaders. They would never have been in government. So that's a very positive step forward. But we're just really in a super crisis here, and it's global. Fascism is on the rise around the world, and in the United States is leading the way in lots of ways.
We have a bit of an interesting phenomenon, really, where a lot of Australian activists look to the US for examples and to learn from, because, you have had really amazing movements, and also you've had a lot of publication, and we get the books or the movies or that document US campaigns, but we also have to step back and go, your country's really different and it's not doing so well. We need to learn from our own experiences here and craft solutions that fit our context,
Absolutely.
One bit that you just said in there around calling things wins when they're not wins. And I see this a lot. I think it's people trying to maintain hope and keep their base engaged and feel like what they do makes a difference. But sometimes that can be kind of political miseducation. It's saying to people, what we've got now is acceptable, rather than kind of raging for more or having an analysis of the system that they're up against and how difficult it actually is to create change. Any thoughts on that?
Our problems are so profound. It's I think it's basically that, well, there's racism is the number one unifying factor of the right. But also there's resentment, and it's misplaced. So our problem is that we need to tax the rich in the United States because we don't have any money for public sector. And until we tax the rich, nothing is going to be solved. And it's very simple solution. And in fact, the rich were taxed until Reagan came into office in 1980. So we have this in our history. But that is just not something that the Democratic Party is willing to engage. And it is the simplest solution to many of our problems.
I want to thank you for writing this amazing book, Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP, because it helps activists connect to this incredible movement that is so full of lessons and inspiration and power. And yeah, one thought I have is like, how do we get people to engage with it more? I've been involved in the past in doing like study group or book clubs where we kind of read a chapter of the book and then we've got some prompts for discussion. Have there been any initiatives like that around this book or things you'd like?
Yeah, a lot of people have been reading it. I mean, I would love to come to Australia. I've never been there. And if somebody can bring me over, I'd be very happy to go all around the country and talk with people. But because I find like the in-person is really the most effective. The problem is it's a 700-page book. But on the other hand, I think it reads fairly well for something that size. And that's, I think my history as a novelist kind of helped getting the story going. I mean, one of the things I realized when I wrote it was that it couldn't be chronological because then it wouldn't be accurate. Because the success of the movement was about simultaneity. And that insight helped me structure it in such a way that you can really just read something and then skip to something else and read that, so you're not forced to go through every page as the story, unfolds in order. And I think that form conveys the message of simultaneity.
Yeah, and even just like reading through the table of contents, that's educational, just the headlines of these sort of thematic summaries that you do. Yeah, it's like a mini manifesto. It's really well done.
Thank you so much.
As a social movement librarian, I appreciate that kind of thematic categorization, the ways that helps people make meaning from something that might be really huge and overwhelming. How do we break it down in ways that are more accessible?
Thank you so much.
Part of in my heart when I think about that is also like honouring our AIDS activists here and the people from the 80s and 90s who did really profound work here too.
Well, I mean, what I'd really love to do is go all over Australia and do events with local activists in each area. And we could do a historical comparison and have a dialogue about what strategies worked. Of course, you have a much more sane healthcare system. And I realize that it going through cuts and all of that, but that's a very significant difference that we don't have healthcare. And so our needs were very different, but I think it would be a wonderful conversation.
It sure would be. Wow. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for your time. Really good to talk with you.
You've been listening to Commons Conversations on Community Radio 3CR. You just heard an interview between Commons Librarian Holly Hammond and Sarah Schulman, the author of Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993.